simply ignores this distinction and ignores how M preserves the moral knowledge of skeptic Sally. The notion of consequences we can reasonably expect does slide around. But doesn't the Hiker Sally scenario show that it slides on its own accord? Hiker Sally knows that there are, or very likely may be, momentous consequences that are intimately attendant upon her actions. She also knows she has no epistemic fix at all on what these consequences likely are. And when this is the case, reliance on Bergmann's set of reasonably expectable consequences comes especially unglued from the presumptions of common sense moral reasoning, the common sense moral knowing that we were trying to preserve. And if we embrace ST 1 through 4 as skeptical theists, at least as skeptical Reformed theists, to bring Plantinga into it, then the above when is our when. Embracing ST 1 through 4 as theists makes things much worse. Here's why. Anyone who embraces ST 1 through 4 is in effect embracing what let's call the first great conditional, GC1. If God exists, then it pretty much follows, A, that there really are fabulous God-sufficing goods behind the allowing of every instance of horrific suffering we see, and B, that God being God and us being us, even when we see the evils, we have no reason at all to think we will usually, or won't usually, see these fabulous, unseen, God-justifying goods. But entirely compatible with GC1, and almost as compelling, I believe, is the second great conditional, GC2. If God doesn't exist, then it pretty much follows that A, there aren't fabulous God-sufficing goods related to most of the crap we see around us, and that B, in the rare cases where there are such goods for the evils we see, it's entirely likely that we humans are able, with a little investigation, to discern them. Now, Sally is an agnostic. She is, we may suppose, 50-50, or maybe probabilistically indeterminate about the antecedent of GC1, that God exists. And so she's also 50-50, or probabilistically indeterminate about both whether, A or A prime obtains, the first consequent of each conditional, and about whether B or B prime obtains. This can greatly reduce her existential nausea. If God doesn't exist, then there is some likelihood when I don't see a great outweighing good for something, there isn't, so I can go by my perception of the immediate harm that will come from my doing the action and form a belief it's morally wrong. It gives her some room for some faith in this presumption of common sense moral knowing, the presumption that what she sees and doesn't see concerning the relevant consequential goods on her action are representative of the goods there are. But a skeptical Reformed theist who embraces ST1 through ST4 is sure about the antecedent of GC1, that God exists, and so must, by modus ponens, embrace A and B, denying A prime and A B prime. Holding that there are unseen fabulous goods and evils connected intimately with every horrific evil in view, she must abandon all hope that what her common sense sees and doesn't see tracks axiological reality. Skeptical theism works only if you are not a theist. And that, in my view, is the end of skeptical theism. I'm sorry my brother is not here to hear the news.
I'm going to have some closing remarks. I've got a 5-minute time. I'm going to stick to a 5-minute reply. There's a handout coming around because, unfortunately, you have to see it to believe it. No, you have to see it to be able to follow, I think. I'd like to thank Artsky, an ardent opponent of skeptical theism, for taking over from Steve Wykstra, a fellow skeptical theist. The result has been comments that were challenging rather than merely friendly, which has helped me, I hope, to see how the paper can be improved. I have only a few minutes, so I'll focus on what I take to be the most challenging aspect of Artski's comments. The charge that skeptical theists will have to agonize over many obvious moral decisions in the same way that Sally will understandably agonize over the choice in the train track case. This is a problem for skeptical theism because it's contrary to common sense that we should agonize in that way over obvious moral decisions, such as the decision whether to remove an infant from the road when we can see traffic coming and no one else is around to help the baby. Artsky has convinced me that I need to change my formulation of M. When I initially formulated it, I had in mind cases like the baby case just mentioned, but not cases like the train track case. Here's how I would like to revise M so that it handles the train track case, and differences from M are underlined. So it starts off the same way. This is M star. Some actions are intrinsically wrong regardless of their consequences, but for some other actions, our judgments about their consequences matter much more morally speaking. For these latter actions, we morally ought to do these three things. Consider for an appropriate length of time the possible consequences we can reasonably connect with performing them, or with the live alternatives to performing them. B, refrain from performing them if, in light of these considerations, the reasonably expected value of performing them seems significantly lower than the reasonably expected value of one of the live alternatives. And C, perform them if, in light of these considerations, the reasonably expected value of performing them seems significantly higher than the reasonably expected value of each of the live alternatives. Clause A now focuses on consequences reasonably connected with the acts, not just those reasonably expected. And clause B and C focus now on reasonably expected value in light of the consequences in focus in clause A. The expected value of an act in cases where consequences matter is determined by considering both the likelihood and the goodness or badness of its possible consequences mentioned in clause A. An unlikely horrific consequence can offset a likely mildly positive one and keep the expected value of the act low. A natural question arises. Which consequences of an act can we reasonably connect with it and which not? I'll mention with some trepidation some examples of each, which I think will be enough for our purposes. And these are on the handout. So we can reasonably connect a consequence with an act if one of the following is true. This is not an exhaustive list. We can see that the consequence is somewhat likely. Another case, we can't see how likely it is to be a consequence, so we don't think it's likely. But we have some grasp of what it is like and some idea of how it could be a consequence. So in light of this, it seems that thinking about the possible consequence might be of help and that it ought not to be ignored. Here are two cases where we can't reasonably connect a consequence with an act. We can see that the consequence is extremely unlikely. Second, 2B, we have no idea how likely it is to be a consequence, so we don't think it's likely. And we have no grasp of the consequence and no idea how it could be a consequence. And this ignorance seems escapable only by a miraculous revelation. In light of this, it seems that thinking about this possible consequence won't be helpful at all and that ignoring it is permissible and even advisable. In the baby case, the possible negative consequences of rescuing the baby are acknowledged, but ignored by the skeptical theist because they are of the 2B variety. No chance we're going to figure out what those are, not worth thinking about. It's important to notice that they are appropriately ignored even though they aren't viewed as unlikely, as in 2A. In the train track case, the possible negative consequences of leaving to get help, well, that negative consequence is the train-caused death, is of the 1B variety. That's why reasoning in accord with M star allows the skeptical theist to ignore the remote, unknowable, possibly negative, all things considered consequences of rescuing the baby from the road, while also allowing Sally to agonize over the possibility of the train-caused death if she leaves the child and goes for help.
Okay, we've got about 20 minutes for discussion. There are microphones on either side of the auditorium, so please step forward and indicate to which of our two speakers you are directing your question.
My question's for Mike